Everyone laughed at the fat virgin bride, until a rancher shouted, "She's mine now, move back." The dusty main street echoed with cruel laughter, the church bell tolling above the jeers. A woman, mocked all her life for her size, stood, trembling as her uncle tried to sell her off like cattle. But then thundering boots, a shadow across the crowd. A battle-scarred rancher claimed her as his own, silencing every voice with a single roar. What seemed like a rescue was only the beginning, because behind the marriage stood a dangerous truth. Greedy railroad men, a sheriff with dirty hands, and a will that could strip the ranch from them both. And when the sheriff's keys jingle and papers burn in the night, love itself may not be enough to save them. Will this unlikely bride remain the town's laughingstock or rise as the frontier's most powerful matriarch? And when the dust clears, who will stand beside her, and who will be left ruined in shame? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more of the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Willow Creek's Main Street. Dust swirling in eddies around the boots of the gathered townsfolk. The crowd pressed closer, their excitement building like vultures circling wounded prey. Lydia Mae Hawkins clutched her worn Bible to her chest, its familiar leather binding offering little comfort against the sea of mocking faces. Her uncle's iron grip on her arm steered her toward the crude wooden platform outside the Silver Spur Saloon. Each step felt like lead, the jeers and whispers cutting deeper than any knife could. Through tears she refused to let fall. She caught fragments of their cruel words. "Ain't no man desperate enough for that one. How many cows you reckon she's worth? Better throw in some extra feed with that deal." The laughter that followed made her stomach churn. Sheriff Cole Braddock lounged against a post, picking at his teeth with a splinter of wood. His badge caught the sunlight, a mockery of the protection it was supposed to represent. His eyes slid over her without interest, clearly enjoying the spectacle, but not bothering to maintain even a pretense of order. Her uncle roughly pushed her up the 3 steps to the platform. The old boards creaked beneath her feet, and Lydia fought to keep her balance. She fixed her gaze on the distant mountains, trying to find strength in their solid presence. The Bible trembled in her hands as her uncle began his grotesque auction. "All right, you boys know why we're here." His voice carried across the crowd, thick with false joviality. "My niece needs a husband, and some lucky fellow's gonna get himself a ready-made wife today. She can cook, she can clean, and she comes with her own Bible." He yanked the precious book from her hands and waved it around, drawing more cruel laughter. 2 bits. Someone shouted from the crowd. "I'll give you a broken-down mule," called another. "Might need 2 mules to carry her." Lydia's cheeks burned with shame, but she held herself straight. She'd endured their mockery for years, ever since her parents' death had left her in her uncle's less-than-tender care. At 30 years old, she'd learned to wrap dignity around herself like armor. Even as the town dubbed her the fat virgin behind her back, and increasingly to her face. "Come now, surely she's worth more than that." Her uncle's voice held an edge of desperation. His gambling debts wouldn't be satisfied by joke bids, and everyone knew it. "She's a good Christian woman. She'll make some man a fine wife." The bidding continued, each offer more insulting than the last. Lydia's vision blurred, but she blinked hard, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her cry. The crowd's laughter swelled to a roar, the sound seeming to press in on her from all sides. Then suddenly, a deep voice cut through the chaos like a knife. "She's mine now, move back." The words fell like thunder in the sudden silence. The crowd parted, revealing Thomas Hawk Hawkins standing at the edge of the platform. His tall frame cast a long shadow in the afternoon sun, the scar running down his left cheek stark against his tanned skin. His stance was that of a man who'd faced down cavalry charges and hadn't flinched then, either. Lydia's heart skipped a beat. She'd seen Hawk Hawkins before. Of course, everyone in Willow Creek knew of the solitary rancher who'd returned from the war, changed, and withdrawn. But she'd never been this close to him, never heard him speak more than a word or two. In passing, the crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few nervous laughs died quickly under Hawk's steady gaze. His hand rested casually near his holster, not as a threat, but as a reminder of who and what he was. "Now see here, Hawkins," her uncle started, but Hawk cut him off with a look that could have frozen hell itself. "I said she's mine." His voice was quieter now, but no less forceful. "Unless anyone else has something to say about it." His eyes swept the crowd, challenging each face in turn. No one met his gaze for long. Lydia finally dared to look up at him fully. His expression was unreadable, but when his eyes met hers, something flickered there, not pity, which she couldn't have borne, but something else. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition of a fellow soul who'd known what it was to be marked as different. Sheriff Braddock straightened up from his post, suddenly feeling the need to assert his authority. "This ain't exactly legal-like, Hawkins. The lady's uncle here has no right to sell what ain't his to sell," Hawk finished for him. "But since he's so set on it, I'm claiming her fair and square." He reached into his vest and pulled out a leather pouch that landed with a heavy clink at the sheriff's feet. "That should cover any legitimate debts. The rest ain't your concern." The crowd began to murmur, but Hawk wasn't finished. He stepped onto the platform, his boots hollow on the wooden boards, and positioned himself between Lydia and the gathered townspeople. The message was clear. The show was over. "Anyone who's got business with me or mine can find me at my ranch," he announced, his voice carrying to the far edges of the crowd. "Anyone who doesn't can clear out now." The mob's energy deflated, like a punctured balloon. People began to drift away, some still snickering, others looking thoughtful. Sheriff Braddock scooped up the money pouch with a scowl, but made no move to interfere further. Lydia's uncle, seeing his chance at easy money slipping away, opened his mouth to protest. But one look at Hawk's face changed his mind. He backed away, nearly stumbling off the platform in his haste. Only then did Hawk turn to face Lydia fully. He bent down and retrieved her Bible from where it had fallen, dusting it off carefully before holding it out to her. "Reckon you'll be wanting this back, Miss Harper." Lydia took it with trembling hands, clutching it close once more. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ain't nothing to thank me for yet," he replied quietly. "But if you're willing, I've got a wagon waiting. We can talk proper-like at my ranch, away from this circus." For the first time that day, Lydia felt something other than shame and fear. It wasn't quite hope. She didn't dare name it that yet, but it was a flutter of possibility. This man had silenced her tormentors with just his presence and a few well-chosen words. He treated her with more respect in 2 minutes than she'd known in years. She nodded, and when he offered his arm to help her down from the platform, she took it. His strength was steady and sure, nothing like her uncle's rough handling. Together, they walked through the dispersing crowd, heads held high, while behind them, the dust settled on an empty platform and a town that suddenly seemed smaller than it had that morning. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Hawk guided Lydia away from the saloon steps. Behind them, a few lingering townspeople couldn't resist getting in their final jabs. "Looks like the war hero's got himself a big project," someone called out, followed by scattered laughter. "Hope your wagon springs can take it, Hawkins?" Lydia's shoulders tensed at each barb, but Hawk's steady hand at her elbow never wavered. His jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes forward, leading her with quiet purpose through the gauntlet of whispers and sneers. "Now wait just a minute." Her uncle's voice rang out, his boots thundering down the saloon steps. "You can't just take her without proper payment." I got debts to settle." Hawk stopped so abruptly that her uncle nearly ran into them. Without a word, Hawk reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a handful of silver dollars. The coins glinted in the sunlight as he tossed them at her uncle's feet, scattering across the packed dirt. "That's double what you owe," Hawk said, his voice low and dangerous. "Pick it up and crawl back to whatever card game you came from." Her uncle's face reddened, but he wasted no time dropping to his knees, snatching up the silver pieces before anyone else could claim them. The sight of him scrambling in the dirt made Lydia's heart ache, despite everything he'd done to her. Hawk's wagon stood at the hitching post, a sturdy farm wagon with fresh painted wheels and a canvas cover. He helped her up onto the wooden seat, his hands strong and sure as he steadied her climb. The leather seat creaked beneath her weight, and Lydia felt her face flush. But Hawk acted as if he noticed nothing amiss. He took up the reins and clicked to his team, a matched pair of bay horses that moved off smartly at his signal. The wagon wheels crunched through the dirt as they rolled down Willow Creek's main street, past the familiar storefronts that had been the boundaries of Lydia's world for so long. She sat rigid on the seat, her Bible clutched tightly in her lap like a shield. The familiar leather binding was worn smooth from years of handling, its pages holding all the comfort she'd found in her lonely life. Now here she was, being driven away by a virtual stranger, her future as uncertain as morning fog. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the creak of harness leather and the steady clip-clop of hooves. Finally, Hawk cleared his throat. "You'll be safe under my roof, Miss Harper," he said, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "You have my word on that." The simple statement, spoken without flourish or demand, loosened something tight in Lydia's chest. She nodded, not trusting her voice just yet. Hawk pulled the wagon up in front of Whitaker's general store. "Need to get some provisions," he said. "Won't take long." The store's bell jangled as they entered, and Mrs. Whitaker's eyebrows shot up. At the sight of them together, she recovered quickly, though her weathered face creasing into a polite smile. "Afternoon, Mr. Hawkins." "Miss Harper," she nodded to them both. "What can I get for you today?" 20 pounds of flour, Hawk said, setting a list on the counter. 10 pounds of salt, 2 gallons of lamp oil, and whatever else is on that paper. As Mrs. Whitaker gathered their items, Lydia could hear whispers from the back of the store, where 2 women had been examining calico. Their heads were bent together, and though their words weren't clear, their meaning was plain enough in their sidelong glances. Hawk ignored them completely, focusing instead on paying for their purchases and carrying the heavy items out to the wagon. Lydia followed him, her cheeks burning again, but holding her head high as her mama had taught her. They drove out of town as the sun began to sink toward the western mountains. The air grew cooler, and night sounds started to emerge. The cry of a distant coyote, the rustle of wind through prairie grass, the steady chorus of crickets. Out here, away from town, the world felt bigger somehow, more full of possibility. The road wound through rolling hills dotted with pine and scrub oak. After about an hour's drive, Hawk turned onto a narrower track that led to his spread. As they crested a rise, Lydia got her first look at what would be her new home. The ranch house stood solid and square against the darkening sky, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney. A single lantern burned in one window, its light seeming very small in the gathering dusk. The barn loomed larger than the house, with corrals spreading out behind it. Everything looked well-maintained but austere, like its owner. What struck Lydia most was the loneliness of it. No other houses in sight, no neighborly smoke rising from nearby chimneys. Just the vast sky above and the endless prairie. Rolling away in all directions, Hawk pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. He helped her down with the same careful courtesy he'd shown in town, then carried their purchases inside. Lydia followed him through the door, taking in her surroundings with quick, nervous glances. The main room was plain but clean, with a stone hearth at one end where a pot of stew simmered, filling the air with savory smells. A solid table with 4 chairs stood in the center of the room, and a few pieces of simple furniture lined the walls. There were no decorations, save for a cavalry saber mounted above the mantel. "Stew's ready if you're hungry," Hawk said, setting down the supplies. "Been cooking all day." He paused, then added with characteristic directness, "Tomorrow we'll ride into town and see Preacher Roberts. Get things properly done." Lydia nodded, still clutching her Bible. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. This scarred, quiet man would be her husband. This remote ranch would be her home. Everything familiar was now behind her, for better or worse. "Yes," she managed to say. "That would be proper." Hawk nodded once, seemingly satisfied with her response. He moved to the hearth and lifted the lid of the stew pot, steam rising in the lantern light. The domestic gesture seemed oddly touching, coming from his big, calloused hands. The first gray light of dawn crept through the cabin's small windows, finding Lydia already awake. She'd spent a restless night in the spare room Hawk had prepared, her mind churning with questions about her. Sudden change in circumstances. Rather than lie there fretting, she decided to put her hands to work. The kitchen area was simple but well stocked. Hawk clearly believed in keeping basic provisions on hand. Lydia found cornmeal, eggs, and salt pork stored in the cool pantry. The wood stove still held warm coals from the night before, and she soon had it drawing well with fresh kindling. Her movements were sure and practiced as she mixed the cornbread batter. At least here was something she knew how to do well, even if everything else in her life felt uncertain. The familiar motions brought comfort, sifting the cornmeal, adding just the right amount of salt, working quickly before the leavening lost its strength, the cabin filled with the warm scent of baking bread. As morning light strengthened outside, Lydia had just started the eggs when heavy bootsteps on the porch announced Hawk's return from the barn. He paused in the doorway, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Didn't expect to find breakfast waiting," he said, removing his hat. His eyes took in the neat table setting, the steaming coffee pot, the golden cornbread cooling on the counter. "I hope you don't mind," Lydia said, suddenly uncertain. "I found everything in the pantry. Mind?" Hawk shook his head. "Been a long while since anyone but me cooked in this kitchen. Smells a sight better than my usual fare." He washed up at the pump sink while Lydia finished with the eggs, scrambling them with bits of salt pork just as her mother had taught her. When they sat down to eat, the silence felt less strained than the night before, filled now with the homey sounds of breakfast. Hawk ate steadily, taking seconds of both cornbread and eggs. Lydia found her appetite improving too, though anxiety still fluttered in her stomach. She could feel him gathering himself to speak, choosing his words with care. "There's something you need to know," he said finally, setting down his coffee cup. "About why I spoke up yesterday." Lydia's hands stilled in her lap. Here it came, the explanation she'd both craved and dreaded. "My father died 6 months ago," Hawk continued, his voice matter-of-fact. "He left the ranch to me, but there was a condition in his will. I have to be married by the end of this month to retain legal control of the property." The words fell like stones into still water. Lydia felt her fragile hope sink with them. "I see," she said quietly. "And without proof of marriage, the railroad gets first claim on the land," Hawk confirmed. "Their agent Kearney has been sniffing around for months, waiting for the deadline. He knows about the clause in the will." Lydia's fingers twisted. "In her apron. Yesterday, when you spoke up, it was because you needed any wife at all, just to keep the ranch." Hawk's scarred face tightened. "I wouldn't have spoken if I didn't mean it. Could have found other ways, Maybe, if that's all it was. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. But yes, keeping this land is my first concern, been in my family 3 generations. Can't let it go without a fight. Lydia nodded slowly, trying to accept this hard truth. She was necessary, not wanted. But wasn't that better than being neither? At least Hawk was honest about his motives. I understand, she said, and was proud that her voice remained steady. You needed a wife, and I needed rescue. The last word tasted bitter, but it was true enough. It's not just that, Hawk said, frowning. What they were doing to you yesterday, it wasn't right. No decent man could stand by and watch it. Some of the tightness in Lydia's chest eased at his words. Whatever his reasons, he had stopped her public humiliation. That counted for something. They finished breakfast in silence. Then Hawk went to hitch up the wagon for their drive into town. Lydia washed the dishes and tidied the kitchen, trying to keep her hands busy while her mind whirled. By the time she climbed up onto the wagon seat, wearing her best dress and clutching her mother's old lace handkerchief, she had achieved a kind of calm acceptance. The morning was warming quickly as they drove toward town. The prairie stretched wide around them, waves of grass bending in the breeze. Hawk handled the reins competently, guiding the horses around the worst ruts in the trail. They passed the time in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable one. Both had much to think about. Lydia watched the landscape roll past, seeing it with new eyes now that it would be her home. The vast emptiness that had seemed lonely last night now spoke of possibility. No close neighbors meant no watching eyes, no whispered comments about her size or spinsterhood. Perhaps here she could finally find some peace, even if it came without romance. The sun was high by the time they reached the small, whitewashed church on the outskirts of Willow Creek. Its bell gleamed in the morning light, and Lydia could see Preacher Roberts waiting on the steps. Hawk had sent word the evening before, arranging everything with his usual efficiency. The wagon wheels crunched to a stop in the churchyard. Hawk helped Lydia down, his strong hands steady and impersonal. They faced each other for a moment in the bright morning light, the scarred veteran and the unwanted spinster, about to bind their lives together for reasons of necessity rather than love. Ready? Hawk asked simply. Lydia squared her shoulders and nodded. Whatever came next, she would face it with dignity. Yes, she said. I'm ready. They turned toward the church steps where Preacher Roberts waited, his Bible already in hand. The small bell above them caught the sun's rays, throwing golden light across the weathered boards of the church. It was time, inside the small church. Dust motes danced in the morning light, filtering through plain glass windows. The wooden floorboards creaked under Lydia's feet as she and Hawk approached the altar where Preacher Roberts stood waiting. The minister's hand shook visibly as he opened the heavy leather-bound marriage book, his spectacles slipping down his nose. A shadow darkened the doorway as Sheriff Braddock leaned against the frame. Arms crossed over his badge. His knowing smirk made Lydia's stomach tighten. She'd seen that same expression when he'd watched her humiliation in town yesterday, doing nothing to stop it. Now then, Preacher Roberts cleared his throat, glancing nervously between the couple and the sheriff. There's the matter of witnesses. For a proper marriage, we'll need respectable members of the community too. Since when? Talc's voice was low, but carried an edge sharp as a knife. The preacher dabbed at his forehead with a handkerchief. Well, you see, there's been some concern expressed by certain prominent citizens about the hasty nature of this union, to ensure everything. It's properly legal and binding, prominent citizens. Hawk took a step forward, his shoulders tensing. Or railroad money. Lydia could feel the anger building in him like a summer storm. Gently, she touched his sleeve, feeling the muscles coiled tight beneath the fabric. His head turned slightly. At her touch, and some of the tension eased from his stance. "Now, Mr. Hawkins," the preacher stammered, "I'm simply trying to protect everyone's interests here. With all the talk in town, we'll witness." The quiet voice came from the back of the church. Mrs. Durham and Mrs. Peterson, both widows of more than 10 years, rose from their usual pew near the rear wall. Lydia recognized them from town. They'd always given her kind smiles when others turned away. Mrs. Durham's gray head was held high as she walked forward. "We've attended this church for 30 years between us. I reckon that's respectable enough." Mrs. Peterson nodded firmly. "And we'll be proud to sign our names to it." The preacher's mouth opened and closed, but he found no more excuses. Sheriff Braddock's smirk faded slightly as he watched the two elderly women take their places on either side of the couple. "Very well then," Preacher Roberts said, adjusting his spectacles. "Let us proceed." The ceremony itself was brief and plain, like most frontier weddings. No fancy words or elaborate promises, just the simple, ancient vows spoken clearly in the morning light. Hawk's voice was steady and sure, while Lydia's trembled slightly but grew stronger with each word. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the preacher declared, closing his Bible. Hawk's signature in the marriage book was bold and firm. Lydia wrote her new name carefully, Lydia May Hawkins, watching the ink dry on the page. The two widows added their signatures as witnesses, Mrs. Durham patting Lydia's hand gently when she finished. They emerged from the church into the bright sunlight. On the wooden steps, Hawk surprised Lydia by turning to face her. His rough hands were gentle as he tilted her face up, pressing a light kiss to her forehead. It was a gesture of respect more than passion, but Lydia felt warmth spread through her chest nonetheless. "It won't stand up." Sheriff Braddock's drawl cut through the moment. He hadn't moved from his post by the door. "Railroad's lawyers will tear it apart first chance they get. Might want to remember that, Hawk." Hawk didn't even glance at the sheriff. Instead, he offered his arm to Lydia, helping her down the steps with careful courtesy. The wagon waited where they'd left it, horses stamping patiently in the dust. The drive home was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts as the sun began its slow descent toward evening. Shadows lengthened across the prairie grass, and a cool breeze carried the scent of sage. Lydia's hands were clasped in her lap, her mother's handkerchief still tucked between her fingers. Her lips moved silently in prayer as the wagon swayed. Beneath them, she prayed for strength, for wisdom, for the ability to be a good wife to this man who had saved her from shame. Most of all, she prayed that this marriage, born of necessity and sealed under threats, might somehow grow into something real and lasting. The air grew heavy as dusk approached, matching the weight of their unspoken fears. The sheriff's warning hung between them like storm clouds on the horizon. But when Hawk's hand briefly covered hers on the wagon seat, steady and warm, Lydia felt a small spark of hope kindle in her heart. They were married now, whatever anyone might say about it. Perhaps that would be enough to weather whatever challenges lay ahead. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Hawkins ranch as Lydia surveyed the kitchen with determined eyes. Her new domain was sparse but serviceable. A sturdy cook stove, well-seasoned cast-iron pots, and basic provisions lined the shelves. Rolling up her sleeves, she set to work. Grateful for the familiar routine of cooking that helped settle her nerves, the sound of boots on the porch made her pause. Hawk's tall frame filled the doorway, and behind him stood a Mexican couple she hadn't noticed earlier during the rushed morning departure. "Lydia," Hawk said, his voice gentler than she'd heard before. "These are Miguel and Rosa Alvarez. They've worked this spread near 7 years now." Rosa stepped forward, her dark eyes warm and welcoming. She was a small woman with silver threading through her black hair, wrapped neatly in a braid. "Welcome, Senora Hawkins," she said, her accent musical. "It is good to have a woman's touch in this house again." Miguel nodded respectfully, his weathered face creasing into a smile. See, the ranch has been too quiet for too long. Lydia felt her tension ease at their genuine welcome. I'm making beef stew and biscuits, she offered. There's plenty for everyone. Rosa's eyes brightened. Let me help you, she said, already moving toward the counter. Miguel, go wash up. These men, they bring all the dust of the prairie into the kitchen if we let them. A surprised chuckle escaped Miguel, and even Hawk's mouth twitched. Lydia watched them go, noting how differently Hawk carried himself around the Alvarezes compared to his rigid stance in town. There was trust here, built over years. Working alongside Rosa felt natural. The older woman showed Lydia where everything was kept, sharing little tricks about the temperamental stove. They worked in comfortable harmony, the kitchen filling with the rich scent of simmering beef and herbs. The center, he is not always so serious, Rosa confided as she helped Lydia shape biscuits. The war changed him, but he has a good heart. You will see. When supper was ready, they gathered around the long table in the main room. The savory steam rising from the bowls seemed to melt away the last of the day's tensions. Miguel blessed the food in Spanish, his words flowing like a gentle stream, though Lydia couldn't understand them. The first spoonful brought appreciative murmurs from the men. This is real fine cooking, Ms. Lydia, Miguel said, reaching for a biscuit. Been too long since we had more than bachelor fare around here. Hawk's cooking that bad? Lydia asked without thinking. Rosa let out a bright laugh. Sometimes the dogs wouldn't even eat it. That's not true, Hawk protested, but his eyes held a glimmer of amusement. They always ate it, eventually. The laughter that followed felt like sunshine breaking through clouds. Lydia watched in wonder as the stern man she'd married slowly relaxed, drawn into comfortable conversation with the Alvarezes about the day's ranch work. The house itself seemed to wake up as if it had been holding its breath for years, waiting for voices and warmth to fill its rooms again. After the meal, Rosa insisted on helping with the dishes, despite Lydia's protests. The men moved to the back porch to wash. Up from the day's work, through the window, Lydia caught glimpses of them as she dried plates, and then her hand stilled as Hawk removed his shirt to splash water over his dust-covered torso. The scars were worse than she'd imagined. Long marks crossed his back, some puckered and dark, others faded to silver. A large, jagged scar wrapped around his left side, speaking of a wound that should have been fatal. Lydia's heart clenched, seeing not the intimidating giant from town, but a man who had endured terrible things. The war, Rosa said softly beside her, following Lydia's gaze. He never speaks of it, but those scars, they carry more than jest. The wounds we can see. Lydia nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She understood now why Hawk carried himself as if expecting attack, why he held himself apart from others. What horrors had he witnessed that still haunted him? Later, after Miguel and Rosa had returned to their small house near the barn, Lydia prepared for bed in the room Hawk had given her. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a small table that held her Bible. The quiet felt heavy after the lively supper hour. Following her nightly custom, Lydia knelt beside the bed. She closed her eyes and began to pray aloud, her soft voice carrying in the stillness. Dear Lord, thank you for this day and for bringing me to this place. Please bless this uncertain union and help me be a good wife. Watch over this household and all who dwell here. Give us strength and wisdom for whatever lies ahead. And Lord, she hesitated, then continued, please help heal the wounds that run deeper than scars. Amen. A floorboard creaked, and Lydia opened her eyes to find Hawk standing in the doorway. How long he had been there, she couldn't tell, but something in his expression made her breath catch. The hard shield he usually wore had cracked, revealing a glimpse of raw vulnerability. Slowly, as if drawn by an invisible thread, Hawk moved into the room. After a moment's hesitation, He lowered himself to kneel beside her, his large frame awkward, in the unfamiliar position. "Been a long time," he said roughly, "since I said any prayers." "Not since," he trailed off, but Lydia understood. "Not since the war. Would you like to pray with me?" she asked gently. Hawk nodded, his eyes fixed on their joined hands resting on the bed cover. His voice was uncertain at first as he stumbled through half-remembered words from childhood prayers. But as he continued, the words came easier, like water breaking through a dam. "Lord," he finished hoarsely, "help me be worthy of this chance you've given me. Amen." When he looked up, their eyes met in the lamplight. Lydia felt her heart skip at the openness she saw there, the yearning for something he'd thought lost forever. She offered him a small, encouraging smile. For the first time since their hasty marriage, hope bloomed in her chest, not just for survival, but for something deeper, perhaps. With time and patience, the walls around Hawk's heart might truly begin to fall. The morning sun painted long shadows across the yard as Lydia surveyed the neglected garden patch behind the ranch house. Weeds had claimed much of the space, but she could see the remnants of old planting rows beneath the tangle. Rolling up her sleeves, she set to work. Grateful for the familiar task, her fingers remembered the rhythms of gardening from her childhood. Before her parents' passing had left her at her uncle's mercy, she pulled weeds steadily, creating neat piles beside her. The earth felt rich beneath the surface, good soil just waiting for care. Rosa appeared with a basket of bean seeds and some tools. "I saved these from last season's crop," she said, setting them down. "The garden has been lonely for a woman's touch." Lydia smiled gratefully. "Thank you. Would you show me where the best spots are for planting?" Together, they worked through the morning. Rosa's knowledge of desert growing seasons proved invaluable as they prepared rows for the beans. The older woman shared stories of past harvests while they worked, painting pictures of autumn abundance that made Lydia's heart lift with possibility. Near the chicken coop, Lydia paused to wipe sweat from her brow. The structure leaned precariously, its boards weathered gray. "That needs mending before we can keep chickens again," Rosa observed. "I can fix it," Lydia said, examining the loose boards. Her uncle had taught her basic carpentry, one of the few useful things she'd gained from those harsh years. She found a hammer and nails in the barn and set to work, carefully straightening boards and reinforcing weak spots. The sun climbed higher. As she worked, the steady rhythm of hammering filled the yard, punctuated by the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the windmill. Lydia felt satisfaction in each nail-driven true, each board set straight. This place needed so much care, but she found herself wanting to give it. As noon approached, movement near the corral caught her eye. Two small figures stood in the shadows of the fence. Children, but not from any settler family she knew. Their dark eyes watched the ranch house warily while they pressed close together, the older one keeping slightly in front of the younger. Miguel noticed them too. He straightened from his work on a saddle, his hand moving toward his belt. "You children," he called out in warning. "They sometimes come looking to steal food." The children tensed at his voice, but didn't run. Lydia saw how thin they were, their clothes worn but clean. The smaller one, a girl, couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her brother looked about 10, his stance protective. "Wait," Lydia said, as Miguel started toward them. She set down her hammer and walked slowly to the kitchen, feeling their eyes follow her. When she emerged with a loaf of bread and a water jug, the ranch hands exchanged uneasy looks. "Miss Lydia," Miguel cautioned, "the townsfolk won't like us feeding Indians. They say it only encourages them to keep coming around." "They're children," Lydia replied firmly. She approached the corral, moving unhurriedly. The boy shifted, ready to run, but hunger held them in place. "It's all right," she said softly. "You're welcome to some food and water." The screen door creaked, and Hawk's heavy steps crossed the porch. "Lydia." His voice held warning. "This isn't wise." She turned to face her husband, still holding out the bread. "They're hungry, Hawk. Look at them. Really look." His jaw worked as he studied the children. The girl had unconsciously reached for the bread, then pulled her hand back. Her brother's eyes darted between Hawk and Lydia, measuring threat against desperate need. "The neighbors will talk," Hawk said, but his voice had softened. "Word travels fast out here." "Let them talk," Lydia answered. "I won't turn hungry children away from my door, no matter who they are." She met his gaze steadily. God made no such divisions between his children. Something shifted in Hawk's expression: surprise, uncertainty, and something deeper she couldn't name. After a long moment, he gave a short nod. Lydia turned back to the children and broke the bread in half, holding it out. The boy took it carefully, handed the larger portion to his sister, then watched Lydia pour water into 2 tin cups Miguel brought over. They ate quickly, but neatly, the girl looking up occasionally with solemn eyes. When Lydia offered more bread, they accepted with small nods of thanks. She noticed the boy had tied his worn moccasins with strips of bark, a makeshift repair that spoke of resourcefulness and need. "I used to teach Sunday school," she told Hawk quietly as they watched the children eat. Those children learned their verses right alongside everyone else's. They played together at recess until their parents taught them not to. She shook her head. "I cannot harden my heart now, even if others think I should." Hawk shifted beside her. "Your courage unsettles me," he admitted in a low voice. "You see straight to the heart of things, where I've learned to look away." He paused. "Be careful, Lydia. The world ain't always kind to those who challenge its rules." When the children finished eating, Lydia wrapped more bread and some dried beef in clean cloth. The boy accepted the bundle with dignity, touching his chest in thanks. His sister smiled shyly before they turned to go, vanishing into the prairie. Grass as quietly as they had come. The evening settled soft around the ranch house as Lydia prepared supper. The familiar work of cooking helped her sort through the day's events. She hadn't meant to challenge Hawk so directly, but neither could she have acted differently. They ate in comfortable quiet, the lamplight casting warm shadows. Hawk seemed thoughtful, less guarded than usual. When he spoke, his voice was gruff, but gentle. "You're changing things here," he said. "It's been so long since anyone questioned how we do things. I'd forgotten there might be other ways." Lydia looked up from her plate. "Is that a bad thing?" "No," he met her eyes. "Reckon it might be just what this place needs." She felt warmth bloom in her chest at his words. Perhaps this marriage of convenience held seeds of something deeper, if they both had the courage to let it grow. The lamp flickered as they finished their meal, its light touching the worn table where they sat, no longer quite strangers, not yet fully comfortable, but finding their way toward understanding. One small step at a time. The wagon wheels creaked as they rolled down the rutted road toward Willow Creek. Lydia sat straight-backed beside Hawk, our Bible resting in her lap, like a shield. The morning sun beat down mercilessly, but she'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders anyway, seeking whatever protection it might offer. "We need more seed if we're to expand the kitchen garden," Hawk said, breaking the comfortable silence that had grown between them over the past days. "And I reckon the house could use some touching up if you've a mind to choose fabric." Lydia's heart lifted at his words. The bare windows of their home had been haunting her thoughts. "Some curtains would be nice," she admitted softly. "And perhaps tablecloths, if it's not too dear." He nodded, his expression softening as he glanced at her. "Get whatever you need. The ranch is doing well enough." The familiar buildings of Willow Creek came into view, and Lydia felt her shoulders tense. She hadn't returned since their wedding day. The wagon slowed as they approached Main Street, and the usual bustle of the town seemed to pause. Heads turned. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes tracked their progress down the dusty street. "Well, if it ain't Hawk and his new bride," called out a voice thick with mockery. "How's married life treating you, big girl?" Lydia kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, but her cheeks burned. She could feel the stares of the women gathered outside the millinery, their whispers carrying clearly in the morning air. "Never thought Hawk would settle for a cow," one woman muttered, loud enough to be heard. "Must be getting desperate out there on that lonely ranch." Hawk's jaw clenched, but he said nothing as he guided the wagon to a halt in front of the mercantile. He climbed down first, then reached up to help Lydia. His hands were steady and strong at her waist, but she could feel tension radiating through. His touch, a group of young men loitered near the water trough, watching. One of them, Billy Preston, who'd once pulled Lydia's hair in Sunday school, stepped forward with a smirk twisting his features. "Say, Hawk," he drawled, "didn't know you. We're such a charitable man, taking in strays like that." He jerked his chin toward Lydia. "Or did you just figure any port in a storm would do?" The words had barely left his mouth when Hawk moved. One moment he was beside Lydia. The next he had Billy Preston by the collar, lifting the younger man nearly off his feet. The smirk vanished from Billy's face as Hawk's eyes blazed with barely contained fury. "That's my wife you're speaking of," Hawk growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Not your jest, not your concern. My wife." The street had gone deathly quiet. Even the horses seemed to sense the tension, shifting nervously in their traces. Billy's face had gone pale, his hands scrabbling uselessly at Hawk's iron grip. "Hawk!" Lydia's voice trembled slightly as she touched his arm. "Please, he's not worth it." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't listen. Then slowly, deliberately, Hawk lowered Billy back to his feet. "You speak of her again," he said, each word precise and sharp as a knife, "and we'll finish this conversation different." He released Billy's collar with a small shove. The younger man stumbled backward, tugging his shirt straight with shaking hands. The watching crowd seemed to hold its breath. "Come on," Hawk said quietly to Lydia. "Let's get what we came for." Inside the mercantile, the familiar smell of coffee and leather goods wrapped around them. "Mr. Jenkins." The owner watched them nervously from behind his counter, but said nothing as they moved through the store. Lydia ran her fingers over bolts of fabric, trying to steady her racing heart. The gingham caught her eye, cheerful blue and white checks that would brighten their dark windows. She imagined them hanging in the kitchen, moving gently in the morning breeze. "This one?" she asked softly, glancing at Hawk. He stood close behind her, still radiating tension, but gentler now. "It's pretty," he said, "like your eyes when you smile." The words seemed to surprise them both. Lydia felt warmth bloom in her chest, different from the earlier flush of shame. She chose several yards of the gingham, adding some plain muslin for everyday use. Hawk insisted on purchasing thread and scissors as well, along with the seed they did. Come for the wagon ride home felt different than the journey in. The sun was lower now, painting the prairie grass gold. Neither of them spoke until they were well clear of town. "I'm sorry," Hawk said finally, his voice rough. "Shouldn't have lost my temper like that. Probably just made things worse." Lydia looked down at her hands, clasped around her Bible. "You scared me a little," she admitted, "but it meant something, hearing you claim me as your wife. Not just a convenience or a necessity, but your wife." He was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. "Reckon I surprised myself?" he said slowly. "Been so long since I cared what anyone thought or said. But hearing them mock you," he shook his head. "It ain't right." The wagon swayed gently as they traveled, the familiar landscape rolling past. Lydia found herself relaxing despite the morning's tensions. The fabric beside her promised cheerful curtains and fresh beginnings. Hawk's steady presence beside her felt more like protection than constraint. As evening approached, their ranch house came into view. The windows were dark and bare, but Lydia could already imagine them brightened by gingham curtains. She thought of the garden with its newly planted beans, of the mended chicken coop, of small changes slowly transforming this place into a home. Hawk helped her down from the wagon, his touch lingering longer than necessary. "You're changing things," he said quietly. "Not just curtains and gardens, something deeper." She met his eyes in the fading light, seeing past the scars to the man beneath, still learning, like her, how to trust this fragile thing growing between them. "Good changes?" she asked. His answer was slow but certain. "Yes, good changes." They walked together toward the house, leaving the wagon to be unloaded later. The prairie wind whispered around them, carrying the promise of stars and quieter. Moments ahead, a week passed like wind over prairie grass, each day bringing small changes to the Hawkins ranch. Gingham curtains now danced in the kitchen windows, and the garden showed promising green sprouts. But the biggest change came when Hawk returned from town one evening, his expression both determined and gentle. "I spoke with Reverend Matthews today," he said, as Lydia served their supper.
"Ask them to perform another ceremony?"
"A proper one, with the whole town invited." Lydia's hand trembled as she set down the coffee pot. "The whole town." Her voice quavered. "But why? We're already married." Hawk reached across the table, his scarred hand covering hers. "Because you deserve to be honored, not hidden away like something shameful. I want them all to see what I see. A woman of worth." Tears pricked at Lydia's eyes. She turned to wipe them with her apron, remembering all too clearly the jeers and whispers of their first ceremony. "They'll only come to mock again. Let them try." Hawk's voice carried the same quiet force it had held that day on the saloon steps. "Things are different now. We're different." The next evening found Lydia at the kitchen table, carefully stitching by lamplight. The gingham fabric, the same she'd chosen for their curtains, was slowly taking shape into a simple dress. Her needle flashed silver in the warm light. As Hawk sat nearby, the steady rhythm of his whetstone against steel keeping time with her stitches. "I've never worn a proper bridal gown," she admitted softly, not looking up from her work. "Even as a girl, I never dared dream of one. The other girls used to play at weddings, but they never let me join." The whetstone paused. "Lace and frills don't make the bride," Hawk said gruffly. "It's dignity that matters. The way you carry yourself, the strength inside." Lydia's hands stilled on the fabric. "Do you truly believe that? I've seen you face down prejudice with kindness. Feed hungry children others would chase away. Stand firm when the world tries to shame you." He set aside his tools and moved closer. "That's worth more than any fancy dress." She touched the simple blue and white checks of her nearly finished gown. "Then I'll wear this with pride." Pride. Morning arrived clear and bright, the kind of day that seemed to hold its breath with possibility. Lydia's hands shook as she pinned up her hair, but when she put on the gingham dress, something settled in her heart. The fabric whispered around her ankles as she moved, carrying the scent of sunshine and fresh air from where it had dried on the line. Hawk waited by the wagon, wearing his best shirt and a fresh trimmed beard. His eyes softened when he saw her, and he offered his hand with formal courtesy. "Mrs. Hawkins." The ride to town felt both longer and shorter than usual. Lydia clutched her Bible, drawing strength from its worn leather cover. As they approached the church, she could see crowds gathering, more than she'd expected. Ladies in their Sunday best clustered on the steps, whispering behind gloved hands. Men lounged against hitching posts, some smirking, others merely curious. "Ready?" Hawk asked quietly as he helped her down from the wagon. Lydia squared her shoulders. With you beside me. Yes. They walked toward the church doors together, his hand steady at her elbow. Inside, the small building was packed. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. Lydia heard the whispers start as soon as they entered, some mocking, some surprised at her transformed appearance. But then Hawk's hand gripped hers firmly, and she lifted her chin. They walked down the aisle together, not as reluctant participants this time, but as partners choosing this moment. Reverend Matthews stood waiting at the altar, his expression notably warmer than at their first ceremony. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice carrying to the farthest corners of the church. "We are gathered here today." The familiar words washed over them, but this time they felt different. When Hawk spoke his vows, his voice rang with fierce pride, each word a declaration. "I, Thomas Hawkins, take thee, Lydia May, to be my wedded wife." Tears shone in Lydia's eyes as she replied, but her voice remained steady, growing stronger. With each phrase, "I, Lydia May, take thee, Thomas, to be my wedded husband." A movement at the back of the church caught her attention. Little Elk, one of the ewe children she'd fed, slipped in through the door. His sister, Mourning Dove, followed, close behind. They stood quietly in the shadows, watching with solemn eyes. Then Little Elk began to sing. His young voice rose clear and true, lifting a familiar hymn in his native tongue. The melody of Amazing Grace was unmistakable, though the words were different, more ancient somehow. Carrying the wind and wilderness in their sound, the congregation fell silent, struck still by the unexpected beauty. Mourning Dove's voice joined her brother's, the harmony weaving through the sunlit air like a blessing. Lydia felt tears spilled down her cheeks as the children she'd shown kindness now returned it tenfold, transforming mockery into something sacred. Even those who had come to scoff found themselves touched. Women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Men shifted uncomfortably, unable to maintain their sneers in the face of such innocent grace. The very air in the church seemed to change, hatred giving way to wonder. As the last notes faded, Reverend Matthews cleared his throat, visibly moved. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." He paused, then added with genuine warmth, "You may kiss your bride." Hawk turned to Lydia, his scarred face gentle in the morning light. He lifted her hand to his lips first, a gesture of deep respect. Then he kissed her properly, brief but tender, his touch a promise of protection and partnership renewed. When they turned to face the congregation, Lydia saw something new in the faces before them. The expected ridicule had transformed into reluctant respect, even admiration. She stood tall beside her husband, her simple gingham dress suddenly feeling as fine as any silk wedding gown. Little Elk and Mourning Dove smiled shyly from their place. By the door, their presence a bridge between worlds, their song a reminder that grace could come from unexpected quarters. Hawk nodded to them, acknowledging their gift. While Lydia's heart swelled with gratitude, the silence in the church held a moment longer, not the tense silence of their first ceremony, but something softer, almost reverent. In that moment, Lydia knew they had won something more precious than mere legal recognition. They had won the right to stand together, pride replacing shame, love conquering scorn. Golden afternoon light slanted through the windows of the ranch house as Lydia set out plates on the long wooden table. The china wasn't fancy, just simple white ironstone, but she'd arranged wildflowers in tin cups down the center, bringing color and life to the room. The scent of baking bread mingled with beans simmering on the cook stove and venison roasting. In the brick oven, Miguel and Rosa bustled in and out, helping to arrange benches and chairs borrowed from every corner of the house. Their usual quiet efficiency had given way to cheerful chatter, Rosa humming snatches of wedding songs as she worked. The other ranch hands scrubbed their faces and donned clean shirts, treating the occasion with uncommon respect. When Little Elk and Mourning Dove appeared shyly at the kitchen door, Lydia welcomed them warmly. "Come in, come in. There's plenty for everyone." The children's eyes widened at the feast laid out before them, but they waited politely until invited to sit. Hawk stood at the head of the table, looking almost awkward in his good suit. But when he spoke, his voice carried clear and strong. "This house ain't seen a proper celebration in many years. Today, we change that. Lydia," he glanced at his bride with unmistakable pride, "has made this place a home again. Let's give thanks." Lydia bowed her head, her heart full, as she offered a simple blessing. When she looked up, she caught Hawk watching her with an expression that made her cheeks warm. Around the table, faces bright with genuine happiness looked back at her, not the mockery she'd grown used to in town, but real acceptance. "Pass them beans this way," called Pete, one of the older hands. "Ain't had cooking like this since my mama's table." Laughter rippled around the room as dishes began circulating. Little Elk and Mourning Dove shared quiet smiles, carefully using the unfamiliar forks and spoons. Rosa showed them how to butter their bread, speaking in a gentle mix of Spanish and English that somehow bridged the gap between cultures. The venison was tender, the beans perfectly seasoned, and the fresh bread disappeared as if by magic. But it was the sound of easy conversation and frequent laughter that truly transformed the meal. Stories flowed freely, tales of cattle drives and spring roundups, of horses broken and strays found. Hawk gradually relaxed, his usual stern expression softening as he watched Lydia move among their guests. She seemed to glow from within, her joy illuminating the room more brightly than the afternoon sun. When Little Elk shyly offered to sing again, this time a traditional blessing song of his people, Hawk nodded approval without hesitation. The clear, pure notes filled the ranch house, and Lydia felt tears prick her eyes. This was what she'd dreamed of but never dared hope for. Not just a roof over her head, but a true home filled with warmth and welcome for all who entered. As evening approached, the gathering slowly dispersed. The ranch hands drifted back to their duties, Miguel and Rosa to their small house near the corrals. Little Elk and Mourning Dove left with careful bundles of leftover bread and meat, their thanks expressed in soft words and graceful gestures. The sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold as Hawk and Lydia settled onto the porch steps. He'd shed his coat, and she'd unpinned her hair, letting the cooling breeze play through it. A single lamp burned in the window behind them, casting just enough light to see by. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the colors fade from the sky. Finally, Hawk spoke, his voice thoughtful. "My PA had dreams for this place, you know? Wasn't just about raising cattle or growing crops. He wanted it to be somewhere a man could breathe free, where folks could work honest and live decent, no matter where they came from." Lydia listened intently, hearing the pride and pain mingled in his words. "He sounds like a wise man. He taught me everything I know about ranching, about doing what's right even when it ain't easy." Hawk's hands worked restlessly in his lap. "When I came back from the war, changed and angry, I reckon I forgot some of what he taught me. Got hard, suspicious." "War changes people," Lydia said softly. "But it doesn't have to define them forever." Hawk turned to look at her, his scarred face catching the lamplight. "You remind me of the better parts of myself, the parts I thought were dead and buried." He hesitated. "What about you? What dreams did you have before life got in the way?" Lydia's fingers plucked at her skirt. "I always wanted to teach. Had a little schoolhouse all planned out in my head, with bright windows and flowers in the yard. It would have taught any child who wanted to learn no matter what folks said about them." She smiled wistfully. "Silly notion, maybe. Maybe. No." Hawk's voice was firm. Not silly at all. This ranch could use a school someday. It's plenty of hands with families, plus the settlement's growing. And after today, he glanced in the direction Little Elk and Mourning Dove had gone. Well, maybe. There's more children need teaching than we thought. Hope bloomed in Lydia's chest, warm and unexpected. She turned to thank him, but the words caught in her throat as she found his face closer than she'd realized. His eyes, usually so stern, held a gentleness that made her breath catch. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, Hawk leaned in. His kiss was tender, almost reverent, nothing like the brief pecks they'd shared for ceremony's sake. Lydia felt it down to her toes, this first true expression of affection between them. When they parted, she saw her own wonder mirrored in his face. The peaceful moment shattered as a shout rang out from the direction of the barn. Fire! Fire! In the barn, Hawk was on his feet in an instant, already running. Lydia gathered her skirts and followed, heart pounding. Through the gathering darkness, she could see smoke curling up against the stars, and the ominous orange glow of flames. The ranch hands converged on the barn from all directions. Miguel had already organized a bucket brigade from the nearest. Well, Hawk disappeared into the smoke-filled building, emerging moments later with 2 frightened horses. Rosa led them well away while the men attacked the flames. Lydia pitched in without hesitation, passing buckets and wet blankets where needed. The fire had started in a corner where hay was stored, but they caught it before it could spread far. Within an hour, the danger was past. Though the acrid smell of smoke hung heavy in the air as the hands checked for remaining hot spots, Hawk prowled the perimeter of the barn. His expression had turned dangerous, and Lydia could see the tension vibrating through his body. When he bent to examine something on the ground, his curse was quiet but fierce. "Oil-soaked rags," he growled. This was no accident. Railroads getting bold, sending their thugs right onto my land. Lydia hurried to his side, laying a hand on his arm. She could feel him trembling with fury. "We're all safe," she reminded him softly. "The damage isn't too bad. They think they can chase me off." Hawk's voice rose, rage breaking through his control. "Think they can threaten what's mine? I'll see them in hell first. This is my father's land, my home, He broke off, pulling Lydia roughly. Against his chest, my wife. They won't take any of it from me. Lydia pressed her face into his smoke-scented shirt, her own delayed fear catching up with her. Almost without conscious thought, she began to pray aloud, her voice shaking but determined. "Lord, protect this place and these people. Guard us against those who would do harm. Give us strength to stand firm and wisdom to know the way forward." She felt some of the tension ease from Hawk's body as she prayed. His arms remained tight around her, but the murderous fury gradually faded from his expression. When she finished, he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Amen," he whispered roughly. "And God help any man who tries to come between us now." The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty street as Hawk guided the wagon into town. Lydia sat beside him, clutching a leather folder containing their copy of the marriage certificate. 2 days had passed since the fire at the barn, and while the acrid smell of smoke had faded, tension still hung thick in the air. Hawk's jaw was set tight, his eyes scanning the street as if expecting another attack. Lydia reached over and touched his arm gently, feeling the muscles bunched beneath his sleeve. "The Lord will see us through," she murmured. Though her own heart fluttered with anxiety, the county clerk's office occupied a narrow building between the general store and the telegraph office. As they approached, Lydia noticed Sheriff Braddock lounging against the hitching post, cleaning his fingernails with a pocket knife. His badge caught the morning light as he straightened, a knowing smirk playing across his face. "Well now, if it ain't the happy couple," he drawled, making no move to clear the way to the door. come to make things official. Have you?" Hawk's hand tightened on the wagon's brake. "Move aside, Braddock. We've got business with the clerk." The sheriff's smirk widened as he pushed open the office door with exaggerated courtesy. "After you, Mrs. Hawkins, if that is your proper name." Lydia felt her cheeks burn at the implied insult, but she kept her head high as she followed Hawk inside. The clerk's office was cramped and stuffy, smelling of dust and old paper. Behind a scarred wooden counter, the clerk shuffled through documents, with nervous hands avoiding their eyes. "We need to file our marriage certificate," Hawk stated, his voice clipped. "Ceremony was performed 8 days ago, witnessed and signed proper." The clerk glanced anxiously at Sheriff Braddock, who had followed them inside. There seems to be a problem with that, Mr. Hawkins." "What problem?" Hawk's tone dropped dangerously low. Instead of answering, the clerk reached beneath the counter and produced a metal box. When he opened it, Lydia's heart nearly stopped. Inside lay only ashes and blackened paper fragments. "Terrible accident," Sheriff Braddock said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "Small fire in the record room 2 nights ago. Marriage book was particularly flammable." Lydia felt the room spin slightly. Their proof of marriage gone. Without it, Hawk couldn't fulfill his father's will requirements. Without it, the railroad could. You burned it. Hawk's voice was deadly quiet. "Railroad paid you to destroy our records." The sheriff spread his hands in mock innocence. "Now that's a serious accusation, Hawkins. Might want to watch that tongue of yours, unless you've got proof." Behind them, the door opened as several townspeople entered, supposedly on business. Their whispered comments carried clearly in the small space. "Poor fools, gonna lose everything now. That's what comes of taking up with damaged goods. Railroad'll have that spread by month's end." Lydia's chest tightened painfully. Every whisper confirmed her deepest fears that she had brought this trouble down on Hawk, that her presence was a curse rather than a blessing. She watched as Hawk's hands curled into fists, his whole body coiling like a spring about to snap. She whispered urgently, touching his arm. "Please, not here. Not like this." He turned to look at her, and the raw fury in his eyes made her flinch. But beneath the rage, she saw something else. Fear, helplessness, the same emotions churning in her own heart. "We need the law on our side," she pleaded softly. "Fighting won't save the ranch." For a moment, she thought he wouldn't listen. His muscles trembled beneath her hand, every instinct clearly screaming for violence. Then, with visible effort, he unclenched his fists. "This ain't over, Braddock," he growled. "You and your railroad friends better watch your step." The sheriff's hand dropped casually to his gun belt. "That's sounding like a threat, Hawkins. Just a fact." Hawk turned away, gentle despite his anger, as he guided Lydia toward the door. "Come on, wife. We're done here." The ride home passed in heavy silence. Lydia couldn't stop turning it over in her mind, all their hopes reduced to ashes in a metal box. Every few minutes, she caught Hawk glancing at her, his expression dark and unreadable. As soon as they reached the ranch, Hawk strode off to check the herds with Miguel, leaving Lydia alone in the kitchen she'd worked so hard to make welcoming. She mechanically began preparing supper, but as she reached for the flour bin, her hands started to shake. The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to muffle her sobs with her apron. All her life, she'd been told she wasn't good enough, wasn't worthy of love or respect. For a brief, shining moment, she dared to believe otherwise. Now it seemed the critics had been right all along. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "I'm so sorry I've brought this trouble on you, Hawk." Unknown to her, Hawk stood in the shadowed doorway, watching. He'd returned to ask about supper, only to find his strong, gentle wife broken down in tears. The sight twisted something in his. Chest, an unfamiliar ache that had nothing to do with anger. He wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, but the words stuck in his throat. He'd spent so many years building walls around his heart, he didn't know how to breach them now. Instead, he stood frozen, torn between his growing tenderness for this woman and the despair threatening to overwhelm them both. Lydia wiped her eyes with trembling fingers and turned back to her cooking, trying to find strength in familiar tasks. Her voice, when she spoke again, was barely a whisper. "Lord, please, don't let me be the reason he loses everything he loves." Hawk stepped back silently, unable to bear the pain in her voice. He'd sworn to protect her, but how could he fight an enemy that struck through legal papers and corrupt officials? How could he convince her of her worth when he couldn't even find the words to express his own growing feelings? The sound of her quiet weeping followed him as he retreated. Each sob, another crack in the armor around his heart. Dawn brought no comfort to the Hawkins ranch. The morning stretched long and silent, broken only by the rhythmic pounding of Hawk's hammer in the barn. Each strike echoed his frustration, driving nails into loose boards with more force than necessary. He had retreated there at first light, shutting out everything including Lydia's gentle attempts to draw him out. Lydia stood at the kitchen window, watching clouds gather over the distant hills. Her heart ached, but she refused to let despair take root. Instead, she turned to what had always sustained her prayer and useful work. Kneading bread dough with practiced hands, she lifted her voice in quiet supplication. "Lord, show us the way forward," she whispered, working the elastic mass with steady movements. "Give us strength to face what comes." The familiar task brought some peace. By mid-morning, fresh loaves filled the kitchen with their homey scent. She wrapped 2 still warm ones for Miguel and Rosa, then gathered eggs and fed the chickens. The routine tasks kept her hands busy while her mind wrestled with their predicament. Through the open barn door, she could see Hawk's broad back as he worked, his movements sharp with contained anger. He had barely spoken since their return from town yesterday. His silence hurt worse than any harsh words might have. The afternoon sun had begun its westward slide, when Lydia heard small footsteps approaching the house. Looking up from her mending, she saw little Elk and Mourning Dove, the Ute children she had fed before. But this time they weren't alone. Between them walked an elderly white man, his clothes trail-worn and dusty. Despite his weathered appearance, he carried himself with dignity, keeping one gnarled hand pressed protectively against his coat pocket. The children guided him carefully, showing the same gentle consideration Lydia had once shown them. "Mrs. Hawkins' little Elk called out softly, using the English name with careful precision. "We bring friend. He asked for Hawk's father before. Now he come to help." Lydia set aside her sewing and stepped onto the porch. "Welcome, children, and welcome, sir. I'm Lydia Hawkins." The old man removed his battered hat, revealing thin white hair. "Ezekiel Greaves, ma'am. I worked as surveyor for James Hawkins years back. These young ones found me in the hills where I've been, keeping out of sight, you might say." Lydia's heart quickened. "Please, come inside, Mr. Greaves. You look like you could use some rest and refreshment." She settled them at the kitchen table, serving bread and coffee to Mr. Greaves, while the children contentedly accepted milk and honey-spread slices. The old surveyor's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his cup, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "The railroad's men drove me off 2 months ago," he explained, voice rough with bitterness. "Didn't want anyone around who knew the truth about this land. But I couldn't leave. Not entirely. Been watching, waiting for my chance." He patted his coat pocket. "Got something here might interest young Hawk. These children, they told me how you treated them with kindness. Made me think perhaps now was the time to step forward." From the pocket, he withdrew a leather portfolio, its contents protected by oilcloth wrapping, Inside lay several carefully preserved documents maps marked with survey lines. And most precious of all, a notarized affidavit bearing James Hawkins' signature. His father was particular about the law, Mr. Greaves explained. Had me witness and file this paper declaring the ranch would pass to Thomas only if he married. Wanted his son to build a proper family, see? But there's more. The document specifies the exact boundaries proven by survey. Railroad can't claim an inch without breaking federal law. Lydia's hands trembled as she examined the papers. Here was the proof they needed. Preserved by God's grace and delivered through the kindness she had shown to hungry children. Her eyes filled with grateful tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for keeping these safe, for coming forward now." "Thank these little ones," Mr. Greaves replied, smiling at the children. "They've been bringing me food, watching over me like guardian angels. When they told me about you and Hawk, how you showed them mercy when others wouldn't, well, I knew it was time." Lydia turned to Little Elk and Mourning Dove, who watched with solemn eyes. "You have done a wonderful thing," she told them earnestly. "Your kindness will not be forgotten." The boy ducked his head shyly while his sister smiled. "You give food when we hungry." Mourning Dove said simply, "Now we help too." The afternoon light was fading when Lydia walked their visitors to the edge of the property. Mr. Greaves would stay with friends in a nearby valley, safely away from railroad influence. The children melted into the gathering dusk with the silent grace of their people, leaving Lydia holding the precious documents close to her heart. Back in the kitchen, she prepared a hearty supper of beef stew and dumplings, adding extra herbs and care to each step. When the meal was ready, she took a deep breath and walked out to the barn. Hawk still worked in the deepening shadows, his shoulders rigid with tension. He didn't look up at her approach. "Supper's ready," she said softly, "and we need to talk. There's something you need to see." He paused, hammer suspended mid-strike. "Nothing to talk about. Railroads got us cornered, legal-wise." "That's not true anymore." Lydia's quiet certainty made him turn. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Hawk. Sometimes he sends help through the most unexpected messengers." She held out her hand. "Come in. Let me show you what was delivered today. We have one last chance, not through fists or fury, but through faith and friendship." Hawk stared at her extended hand for a long moment. The last rays of sunset caught her face, highlighting the gentle strength there, the unwavering hope that had begun to crack his defenses from the first day. Finally, he set down his hammer. His calloused hand engulfed hers as he let her lead him toward the house. Though exhaustion lined his face, his eyes held a glimmer of something new, fragile trust. The first spark of renewed hope died inside, while the stew simmered on the stove. Lydia spread out Mr. Greaves' documents on the kitchen table. As she explained how they had come into her possession, she watched tension gradually ease from Hawk's shoulders. His expression softened as she described the children's role in bringing the surveyor forward. "All this time," he murmured, touching the affidavit with reverent care, "the proof was out there. And it came to us because you showed kindness to those kids when I wanted to drive them away." "The Lord works through love, not force," Lydia replied gently. "Maybe that's what your father understood when he wrote these terms. He wanted more than just a marriage of convenience for you, Hawk. He wanted you to find real happiness." Morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen window as Lydia folded the precious affidavit into her Bible. Hawk paced behind her, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. "Let me handle this," he insisted. "Town ain't safe for you alone." Lydia straightened her shoulders. "I need to face them now." Head held high. "Need to face them now." Head held high, though his jaw clenched with worry. Hawk nodded. They rode side by side into Willow Creek, dust coating their boots as they dismounted at the courthouse steps. Inside, railroad agent Kearney's lip curled in a sneer. "What's this fraud bringing now?" he drawled. Lydia stepped forward, her Bible clutched tight. Raising her right hand, she spoke clear and true. "I swear before God and this court that I am Thomas Hawkins' lawful wife. I bring proof of our right to the ranch." She placed the affidavit before the judge while Hawk stood silent, letting her words ring out. The crowd muttered in surprise at her courage. The judge peered at the documents. "We'll need verification of these claims." Right on cue, Mr. Greaves entered, Little Elk and Mourning Dove at his side. Gasps filled the courtroom as the old surveyor stepped forward to testify. The judge's gavel cracked against wood. "This court affirms the Hawkins marriage valid and legal. Their claim to the ranch stands firm." He turned a stern eye to Sheriff Braddock. "Remove that badge, sir. Your corruption ends today." The railroad men slunk back as federal charges were threatened. Hawk's grip on Lydia's hand tightened, his breath finally easing. Outside, townspeople gathered, whispering now with newfound respect. Hawk drew Lydia into his arms and kissed her tenderly before them all. "The joke was on those who laughed," he declared, voice carrying across the crowd. "This is my wife, my blessing, my home." Tears streamed down Lydia's cheeks as she realized she'd become more than just a bride. She was now the Hawkins Ranch matriarch. Hawk helped her onto their wagon, and they rode home together through the golden evening light. She rested her head on his shoulder, finally feeling truly secure. Weeks drifted by like prairie clouds. The Hawkins Ranch transformed, its doors opened wide to those seeking shelter. Mexican children played tag in the yard, while Ute youngsters helped tend the garden. Inside the big house, Lydia's voice lifted in hymns each evening, teaching little ones to sing praises. Hawk watched his wife bloom like a desert flower. He'd pause in his work just to sit beside her on the porch steps, their hands entwined in comfortable silence. One evening, as their long table groaned with food and fellowship, Hawk stood tall. "My Lydia," he declared, voice gruff with emotion, "saved more than this ranch. She saved me." Later, after the children were tucked in bed, they sat together under the star-filled sky. The lantern's glow spilled warmth from inside their home. As Hawk whispered, "God gave me more than land when he gave me you." Lydia smiled, nestling against his shoulder. The woman once mocked by cruel tongues had found her true calling. The beloved heart of this frontier family. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.